and welcome to our April 2021 blog post. And today we're going to be talking all about tanks. So what's the difference between steel and aluminum tanks, and why do you even care as a diver? So chances are probably pretty high that the last time you went diving, you didn't think much about the tank that you were giving at your dive center. It was more about looking to make sure that you did your visual inspection, making sure it had the sticker, making sure it had the right amount of air, strap it on, and off you went diving. But in reality, the type of tank you're using actually can make a pretty big difference on your buoyancy. And so we're going to talk about why that is and why that matters to you as a diver. So the first thing that you'll notice is we have two types of tanks here. So this blue tank here is your standard aluminum tank, most common scuba tank used around the world, and you've probably encountered this on dives, especially if you went diving in a tropical Caribbean place. Aluminum tanks are the standard there. And on the right, we have our steel tank, standard steel tank. This is one that we use here for our divers. And so at first glance, you're looking at these and you would think that maybe this aluminum tank has more air. Reality, these tanks are both the exact same size when it comes to air. Both of these are 80 cubic foot tanks. So why is the aluminum one bigger? Why do you care? And what's the other differences and why it makes sense to you? So to answer that question, the first thing that we want to look at is a cross section of these two tanks to look at what they look like if we were to cut the tops off. The first thing that you'll notice is that this aluminum tank is quite thick. The walls are a lot thicker. Reason for that is aluminum is a softer metal. It's not quite as dense. And so in order to compress the air inside the tank, the walls have to be thicker so that it doesn't burst, it can hold the air. Whereas if you look at the steel tank, the walls are thinner. Steel is a much stronger metal, heavier metal, and so the walls can be thinner and still compressed to hold that amount of air. So when we look at these, the reason why these tanks hold the same amount of air at different sizes is, again, this tank has to be thicker. You can't compress the air as much because of this aluminum being a softer metal, whereas a steel tank, you can compress the air more to get the 80 cubic feet of air in a smaller space. Now, why this impacts your buoyancy is exactly what we just looked at, as far as the metal being more dense in steel and heavier versus aluminum does impact the buoyancy characteristics of the two tanks. And so let's look what that means. So if you were to hop in the water with a full scuba tank for both of these, with our aluminum tank, you're actually going to be about 1.4 pounds negative using this tank. Whereas the steel tank here, you'll be a little over 8 pounds negative, which means putting this on, this is adding an extra 8 pounds in the water of negative buoyancy to help pull you down. Where that really matters is the end of your dive as you've consumed the air, because again, you want to make sure not only can you get down safely in the water, but you want to be able to make sure that you have enough weight that you can perform a safety stop if needed, and to make sure that you stay down and that you don't rise to the surface too quickly, which can cause problems. So at the end of the dive, at 500 psi, when these tanks would be considered empty, this aluminum tank is actually 3.4 pounds positively buoyant, which means you have to account for that. It's actually going to be pulling you up because of the density, the size of this tank, and its buoyancy properties. You have to compensate. This steel tank is still going to be negative. Even at 500 psi, it's still going to be almost 2 pounds negative. So if you think about that, there's a 6 pound difference between these two tanks. And where that matters to you as a diver is you will be carrying an extra 6 pounds of weight to account for the difference in buoyancy for these two tanks. Now here in Seattle, where you're wearing a thick wetsuit or a dry suit, you may already be carrying a lot of weight. I carry around 32 pounds with my dry suit. So every little bit matters. And that is with me using a steel tank. If I weren't using a steel tank, I might have to carry 38 pounds to account for that. And again, you know that the more weight you carry, the more you got to lug on, the more you got to get in your suit, and the more that you might be walking to your shore dive with. And so that's one of the things that you want to consider when you're thinking about the tank that you're using, are those characteristics. Now, how do you know which tank is right for you? Well, a couple things to consider. One, are you diving in fresh or salt water? That makes a difference. If you're in fresh water, you already don't need as much weight. You might not need a steel tank. What type of exposure suit are you using? If you're in a tropical place and you're not using a thick exposure suit, steel tank might not be necessary, because again, you don't need the weight properties as far as the buoyancy. Here in the Pacific Northwest, where you're already carrying a lot of weight, you're using a thick exposure suit, you might want to opt for a steel tank so that you can help balance that out and not need to carry as much weight on your body, which is sometimes helpful. The other thing is, if you're thinking about purchasing a tank, it's cost. The reason why most dive shops use the aluminum tank, aside from it being easy to get, but it's also cost. These are cheaper than steel tanks, so that's a factor. And then size. If you, especially if you're shorter, sometimes these steel tanks are nice because they're not quite as long. They don't come down your back as much. And so it's really just depending on your personal preference as well as far as what you like. What is important though is that when you're thinking about diving and you're getting your suit set up and you're getting ready to go in and you want to make sure that you can stay neutral in the water, factoring in your tank is an important part of calculating how much weight you're going to need for the dive to make sure that you're not overweighted or underweighted in the water. And if you have questions about how to make sure that you're carrying the right amount of weight and so that you can stay nice and neutral in the water, give us a call. We're happy to talk through it with you. Also happy to look at our Peak Performance Buoyancy class, which is all about making sure that you have the right amount of weight and trim in the water so that you stay nice and negative or neutral buoyant in the water, so that you can manage your air consumption better and protect the environment, which is both important. So thanks for watching today. Hopefully you learned a lot about tanks and some different information about why that's important and why we ask you to write that down in your logbook, because it is an important factor to consider. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the water soon.